This video contains Pandaemonium Raid Series spoilers up to patch 6.01 and references to MSQ trials up to that point as well. Hello and welcome to Endwalker in Review. Today we're going to be taking a critical look at the expansion's first Savage raid from patch 6.01, Pandaemonium Asphodelos, the First Circle Savage. Before we get started, I just want to mention an adjustment I'm making to the series going forward. While I'm happy with what I did with the first two videos in the series, covering the launch extremes, going forward I intend to trim the concept down slightly to make this all a little bit more manageable for me and improve the quality of the videos overall. During these first two videos, I took some time to loosely list the majority of the fight's mechanics as well as show some AoE diagrams. As I'm moving forward onto Savage and eventually we'll be covering Ultimates as well, where more puzzle type mechanics begin showing up and the average encounter complexity increases, in the interest of keeping videos succinct, I'll be explaining the mechanics less and launching straight into my specific critique. Like I've been saying, I'm not trying to make guide videos for these fights, and I think it would be really ideal if my videos could be about as long as the fights themselves, so I don't think I need to mention every raid wide or basic AoE or tank buster. My video on the second extreme trial really had no business being 18 minutes. If you find that you are not familiar enough with the encounter to follow along, please pause and consider checking out guide content from the encounter from your favorite video guide creator or from Toolbox or Raid Plan slideshows available at thepfstrat.com. Also, please feel free to comment and ask any questions if I've been unclear. I'd be happy to elaborate or explain the necessary details to understand anything I covered in the video and reply to any questions. Secondly, I'm also going to be significantly more brief about aesthetics and audio. I'm not really the best art critic. My education and background doesn't necessarily lean into that, so I'll still touch on those topics, but I'll definitely keep that part very short and subjective from this video onward. Either I like it or I don't, and it is what it is. I'm also going to take this opportunity to apologize for the video quality on my 4 Asphodelos videos, as I was streaming and not locally recording, so the bitrate and quality of my footage is lower than it'll be in videos covering later fights. Alright, let's get started now. To address the elephant in the room, the elephant being Erichthonius' very large target ring and the room being the arena, P1S was definitely the first warning sign for players who have been disappointed with the trend of overly large targeting rings in the Endwalker expansion. The boss's target ring is absolutely massive, putting max melee within reach of a majority of the room. At face value, it may seem that much of the mechanics like the Shining Cells phase, Fourfold Shackles, and the Intemperance mechanic actually required the boss's targeting ring to be large so that the mechanics could be executed with uptime, but I'm not convinced that that's actually the case. To explain what I mean, let's take a look at Intemperance, as the problem in my opinion starts here. I can't help but wonder why the 9 squares are separated with these rather thick death lines that instantly kill the player if they're standing in them. Wouldn't it have been fine if they were thin lines and you're either on one side or the other with no in between? I mean, sure, players wouldn't have to run as far during the in-out Jailer's flails that occurred during the second Intemperance, so that part would be easier, but if they had not had these thick lines and the boss's hitbox was smaller to match, then things like the outer cells during Shining Cells would not be full uptime max melee, giving players who want uptime to be something to optimize an uptime challenge to rise to, and a slight tweak to the sizing of Ethereal Shackles and Fourfold Shackles AoEs would have assured that that mechanic could still function full uptime around that smaller target ring. Basically, this one tweak to Intemperance and Shackles could have left those two mechanics full uptime while making Shining Cells not full uptime, allowing for an element of risk and reward around optimizing uptime for at least one part of the fight, and only the single overlap of Ethereal Shackles and Shining Cells towards the end of the fight would be the one time where overly greedy uptime play could cause more than just the one player doing it to die. For players who want uptime to not be free, I think this adjustment would have been the solution. Now let's get into more specific mechanics. First, I want to talk about Pitiless Flail of Purgation or Grace, the tank swapping buster mechanic with a flare or stack on the off tank. As you'll see in this footage from week 1, in progression I was handling this in an overly cautious manner, but by the time of reclears this mechanic felt really great to pull off, especially on Purgation with full uptime, by centering up just a hair's width north of center and stepping through center after the cast, which causes the AoE line damage to point north, but you ride the knockback to max melee distance south. The off tank would end up north of the flare, and as long as both tanks are max melee on opposite sides of the boss, the flare is not deadly. Holy, of course, is simpler, and the main tank can just ride the knockback from center to max melee north and relax from there. Anyway, it's a surprisingly spicy tank buster for the first Savage raid of the expansion. Prior to this in Endwalker, only the first Extreme Trial had a tank swap, and it was a very vanilla matter of provoking and shirking. So adding in a deadly knockback and a proximity flare or holy stack proved to be a very potent combination, which definitely caused a lot of newer tank players to struggle. The first major mechanic for the entire party is Intemperance. In Prague, this mechanic definitely caught my day 1 PFs out because of the flex pattern. Basically, Intemperance happens twice throughout the fight, always with one occurrence where players must flex positions with each other in order to solve the mechanic correctly, and one occurrence where players will not need to flex at all. However, because of the randomness of whether the flex is required during the first Intemperance or the second Intemperance, and because in a PF environment comms are weak and there's not enough time given to look over footage or study the mechanic as a whole, nobody ever noticed that a flex was required in my PF. Also in PF, trust in one another tends to be so low so that when somebody or even the whole party would get a damage down or wipe, nobody even bothered to look at the whole mechanic as a big picture and notice that a flex could ever even be required. I think everybody in my PFs were assuming that someone else had messed up. Later on, in reclears, the flex became contentious as some players wanted tanks to eat the damage down because they were too lazy to learn to execute the flex. As a tank player myself, I was of course very much against this, refusing to join the so-called DD strat parties, and from time to time even offering to give my spot in the grid to a DPS and just performing the flex with the other tank ourselves. But ironically, no DPS player ever accepted this offer. So let this be a PSA to all the physical range players who said they don't know how to flex. You have freedom of movement, and no melee reach restrictions. Be prepared to do flex movements when mechanics call for them. You won't have enablers who accept your behavior in every PF. You're only limiting yourself. Be willing to learn to do things properly, please. It may not be your DD, but it is going to be your PFs that take an eternity to fill when nobody wants to play with you because you're too lazy to learn to do a mechanic correctly. Next up, Shining Cells. Honestly, this is a pretty boring mechanic. I do appreciate the arena turning into a circle here though. Spoiler alert, the arena changing shape comes up a few times later in the expansion, with one case being considerably more interesting than this. And while in P1S it's just from a square to a circle, it's a step up from fights being only one of the two the entire time. Shining Cells is the mechanic I targeted earlier for being full uptime. It's basically just adding an extra condition with the red or white colors on the floor to mix in with Jailer's Flails, the Tank Buster, and toward the end, Ethereal Shackles. Since all the outer positions are still within max melee range, the entirety of Shining Cells phases are full uptime and just a matter of standing on the right color. It's pretty dry. Finally, the last remaining element of the fight to talk about would be Fourfold Shackles, which in my opinion is probably the best mechanic of the fight, but still nothing outstanding. Once again, it can be a full uptime mechanic as long as everyone in the party is positioned well. The obvious solution really did come down to just having an arrangement for which players would travel to a marker based on the timer and color of their debuff. Of course, having players check themselves for newly applied debuffs right away this early in the expansion goes on to become a valuable skill in later encounters, but here there's no more nuance to the execution of the mechanic than that. As long as all players have gone to the right places and survived the first wave of chains going off, they're able to clear the mechanic just by staying still and not panicking. Incoming damage in the fight is pretty infrequent. Raid wides happen quite far apart, with tanks for example having something between them to put on every Warder's Wrath, Shining Cells transition, and Holy Stack from Pitiless Flail of Grace, and my healer friends have never expressed any difficulty with anything in this fight. I can only imagine maybe not being able to hit a faraway player with an AoE heal during Intemperance, but of course there's no shortage of mitigation to apply or even single target spot healing or shielding options to get everyone through the mechanic alive. The enrage was also forgiving. As you can see in my footage, there were several damage downs throughout the entire party as well as a couple of deaths, and yet the boss still died to a PF party in week 1 gear. It's maybe slightly on the easier side for a first boss of the first tier of an expansion. Aesthetically, I think it's great that Ericthonios comes out of the entranceway to the Pandaemonium facility and fights us in the lobby area. These raid lobby instances haven't always been used much outside of the quest lines in past raid series, so it's kind of nice for the environment artists' work to get used this way. It doesn't necessarily have to be this way every time, but it's good this time. Erichthonius himself looks cool and intimidating, and his chains theme helps sell the vibe that he's supposed to be a jailer, albeit not the best one given his need for our assistance with his interment magics. The music follows the same song structure as the track that plays in the lobby, and feels like it's playing off the aesthetics of the arena with its instrumentation, namely organs, giving it a lightly spooky atmosphere. I like the lobby track better, but this one isn't necessarily bad the first few times. Spoilers for the next two videos, but I think that Square Enix using it 3 times in a row definitely overexposed me to it. Anyway, that basically covers what I feel like I have to say about this raid encounter. It's not the most creative or interesting boss mechanically or aesthetically, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad either. In progression, Intemperance and Fourfold Shackles are enough puzzle execution for most groups to chew on for a while, without anything in the fight that's egregiously poorly telegraphed, unclear, or overly difficult for its place in the difficulty hierarchy, so it would be kind of a huge exaggeration to say it's anything less than fine. But there definitely could have been a little bit more uptime risk-reward to play around with in reclears and optimization. Thank you for watching, and please consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps these videos find an audience and keeps you up to date when I release anything new. Thank you, and see you next time for P2S.